Several months ago, while scrolling through Instagram, I stumbled upon a reel by Joel Webbin, a pastor in Texas. I genuinely thought it was either satire or rage bait. I actually laughed at first as Webbin casually explained how his wife wasn't allowed to read a book unless he had read it first and given his approval. I was sure it couldn't be real. But as that clip gained traction and the Instagram algorithm started feeding me similar content, I realized this wasn't a joke or hyperbole, nor was it a winking caricature of patriarchal Christianity. It was entirely sincere. As I was flooded with more and more content, I went down a rabbit hole into a world I had no idea existed. A large and deeply troubling world, from trad wife movement to patriarchy and Christian nationalism, to horrific stories of spousal rape justified under the guise of biblical submission. And I learned that many of these threads eventually led back to the teachings of a man named Doug Wilson, the pastor of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. Wilson was a mentor to Joel Webbin, and at least until a pretty recent Twitter spat, the two created content together. Content in which they absolutely do not shy away from things like Christian nationalism and what they call biblical patriarchy. You might have first heard the name Doug Wilson back in the early 2000s. He made national headlines for co-authoring a pamphlet that attempted to sanitize American slavery. In that pamphlet, titled Southern Slavery as It Was, Wilson argued that slavery in the antebellum South was generally benign and even spiritually beneficial, a claim that sparked immediate public outrage. Historians condemned it, passages were found to be plagiarized, and the backlash catapulted Wilson from relative obscurity into national controversy. But he didn't fade away. In fact, in recent years, Doug Wilson has been back in the spotlight, leading defiant anti-lockdown protests during the COVID-19 pandemic with his church in Moscow, and finding a platform on Tucker Carlson's show where he's been framed as a bold voice for traditional values in a crumbling culture. But Wilson is known for being inflammatory, and he knows how to draw attention. He's also made headlines for, among other things, intentionally outrageous rhetoric about women's subservience to men, or resurfaced statements in which he defends slavery as essentially not that bad. In an era when childless cat ladies was a presidential campaign talking point, and when social media is littered with trad wives and alpha males championing their version of masculinity, the national conversation was primed for Wilson to take center stage. But he was ahead of the curve on this discussion, and a large swath of the country finally seems ready for what he's been preaching. And so the heated battle for the heart of Moscow, Idaho, has become a microcosm for America's culture wars at large. And Wilson has only grown bolder as he's gained more and more influence and notoriety, particularly among young men who feel like society is failing them. His ideas can no longer be written off as fringe extremism. It's been a slow burn, but he's been working for decades to slowly but steadily reshape the nation into his version of Reformed Christianity. As we launch our new series exploring how therapeutic abuse unfolds in the world of Christian counseling, thanks in part to patriarchal systems, there's no better place to start than taking a closer look at the towering influence of Pastor Doug Wilson. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories, and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist's chair. To help us kick off this series on Christian counseling, today I'll be joined by Peter Bell, host of the very popular Sons of Patriarchy podcast. And if you haven't had a chance to listen yet, I highly recommend it. He's one of the leading voices shining light on Doug Wilson's schemes. But before we hear from Peter, I want to give a little background. It was actually Doug's father, Jim Wilson, who first targeted Moscow in the early 70s. He wanted to open a Christian bookstore, and he selected Moscow because it was a fairly progressive hub in an otherwise conservative state. It was small enough that a fundamentalist Christian takeover might be possible, but big enough to send ripples if they were successful. He was also the author of a book on evangelism called Principles of War, which was highly influential in Christian circles, and sort of a handbook for much of what came later. Doug Wilson assumed the mantle for his dad when he became pastor of Christ Church in the 70s. The church is now quite open about their desire to, and I quote, make Moscow a Christian town. And Wilson is clear that this is his vision for the country as a whole. And he's not shy with his use of the word theocracy. Moscow is just a test case. But for decades, he was often more subtle and strategic about his intentions. While he's always been known as a firebrand, and he helped inspire other controversial figures like Mark Driscoll, he remained very calculating over the years, careful to remain just palatable enough to keep growing his influence. The writer for this show, Bo Denton, actually told me it was while working on this episode that he put two and two together, that this Doug Wilson, the slavery apologist who wants to repeal women's suffrage and make America a theocracy, is the same Doug Wilson whose name was all over Christian circles and homeschool literature in the 90s and early 2000s. The same Doug Wilson who represented Christianity as a whole in a series of prominent public debates with atheist Christopher Hitchens. He was always a fundamentalist, sure, and he wasn't afraid to offend people, but he was and is a gifted and compelling communicator. If you weren't immersed in that world, if you were only watching from a distance, it's possible that the full extent of his beliefs weren't always apparent. But at the core of those beliefs is Christian patriarchy. Wilson describes feminism as the single most destructive force in human history, and advocates for repealing the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. Sometimes he might water down that language and talk about a household vote, a system where instead of every individual voting, each household votes as one. But since he believes that men should be the decision-making head of the home, it boils down to the same thing. To Wilson, women in leadership over men, whether in the church, at home, in politics or business, anywhere really, is evidence of how far America has strayed from God's design. He says that a woman who refuses submission is like a planet-defying orbit, and he preaches that Christian men need to take dominion over every aspect of society, government, education, business, arts, entertainment, the whole deal. He even wrote that the nation as a whole should officially adopt the Apostles' Creed, because in his words, a truly free country will have to be Christian. That's actually his vision for the whole world, since his post-millennial theology means Jesus won't come back until every nation on earth has been successfully evangelized. But again, he's strategic. First Moscow, then America, then the whole world. Insert evil diabolical laughter here. This gives off vibes of Sharia law, only with a reformed Christian twist. And I don't say that casually. The parallels are hard to ignore. In both Islamic systems of Sharia law and Wilson's vision of patriarchal Christian nationalism, women's submission to men is seen as divinely ordained, and a woman's behavior, her dress, speech, and reproductive rights are strictly constrained both at home and in public. In both systems, there's very little daylight between religious authority and the law of the land. And there are other versions of this too. On the more charismatic side of Christianity, some leaders talk about what they call the Seven Mountain Mandate. This is a theological imperative to bring every realm of society under Christian control. Family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. To effectively influence a culture, the thinking goes, you have to conquer all seven mountains. Wilson is particularly savvy, though. He knows when to push the envelope and when not to. So for decades in Moscow, he and Christ Church have been building their kingdom, sometimes under the radar and sometimes right out in the open. They have businesses and nonprofits, a K-12 school and college, a publishing house, and Wilson even started a new denomination, the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, for others around the world who want to follow his model. Sometimes over the years, he might have been a little bit circumspect about the long-term vision, about how a takeover of Moscow would be the formula for a theocratic nation. But he seems to realize that this particular American moment is ripe for talking about strong Christian men taking back what they see as theirs. Along with all of their other strategies and programs, Christ Church also has a biblical counseling center, which is what I want to focus on here given the nature of our podcast. Like every other aspect of the church, the counseling center is thoroughly rooted in Wilson's teaching. The consequences of this can be profound, and depending on who you ask, catastrophic. Thanks to platforms like a Vice article from 2021, and more recently the Sons of Patriarchy podcast, stories have surfaced about abused women who were counseled to remain quiet and not rock the boat, told that it was their Christian duty to submit to their husband's desires. Over the decades, Wilson has proven to be pretty adept at deflecting when there's heat on him. He'll make a hat tip to how the Bible talks about husbands and wives mutually submitting to each other, or do some fancy footwork with big theological words, or maybe point to his wife Nancy, who's done plenty of her own writing about how women should be happy and fulfilled with their role of keeping a clean and orderly house, raising obedient children, and remaining always available to their husbands. But despite his rhetorical slipperiness, it's not a stretch to imagine how some of his ideas could be used to silence and subjugate women, even women who are being actively abused at home. Here's a quote from his book, Fidelity. Quote, "However we try, the sexual act cannot be made into an egalitarian pleasuring party. A man penetrates, conquers, colonizes, plants. A woman receives, surrenders, accepts. This is, of course, offensive to all egalitarians, and so our culture has rebelled against the concept of authority and submission in marriage." End quote. And one more quote for good measure, this time from his blog. Quote, "Women have a deep creational need to be loved and led so that they might follow. And men have a deep creational need to be respected and followed. And when these needs are thwarted or otherwise frustrated, the end result is deep unhappiness for both sexes. When feminine leadership becomes widespread and common in society, it's not a sign of progress at all, but is rather a sign of cultural decadence driven by male fecklessness." End quote. Even just looking at the Biblical Counseling Center's website, it's easy to see that Wilson's ideas are baked into how they work with clients. The language of submission is all over the place. Here's an example. Quote, "Biblical counselors must help their counselees submit to legitimate authority in the context of the home. God has called husbands and fathers to exercise spiritual authority in the home, seeking the welfare of those in their care. These authority structures are an incredible blessing when discharged faithfully. Biblical counselors will help family members honor these sources of authority appropriately throughout the various stages of life." End quote. You might hear this and think, well, that's what I believe. That's biblical, and that's how a home should function. And that's entirely valid. Individuals absolutely have the right to organize their lives around their beliefs, including traditional or hierarchical frameworks. The issue arises when those frameworks are positioned as divinely prescribed defaults, especially in a therapeutic context. In these settings, what begins as personal conviction can subtly shift into social spiritual coercion, limiting space for true consent. You can see how easily it would be to twist language like honor and submission and use it to silence and minimize anyone who dares to speak out against their supposed authority, even when that authority is harming them. So Doug Wilson might be able to wipe his hands clean and say he'd never directly condone abuse. But some of his more extreme ideas about patriarchy can still be used to severely undermine a woman's autonomy, including her right to deny sexual consent and protect herself from abuse. And when those ideas translate to a counseling office, a place that is ostensibly about safety, vulnerability, and promoting health and well-being, the effects can be especially catastrophic. For more context about what's happening in Moscow and what it might mean for the rest of the country, I'm so grateful that Peter Bell was able to talk with me for this episode. Peter has extensive background in the church and experience working in a number of different Christian institutions. He is a committed Reformed Christian, but he's not afraid of shining a light on those who promote toxic, harmful ideas under the guise of faith. That's what he's doing with the Sons of Patriarchy podcast, which offers a deep perspective on Doug Wilson and Christ Church, while also looking at the big picture of patriarchy, Christian nationalism, and how often abuse is covered up or condoned in the name of God.
So I grew up in a PCUSA church. The church I was at was strong. It was mainline, but I couldn't have told you what patriarchy was up until I went to Mars Hill. We didn't use the word patriarchy, at least that I recall, at Mars Hill, and this is with Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll was a pastor in Seattle, Washington from 96 until 2014 when everything kind of broke down. If people have heard of Acts 29, it's a kind of church planting network that he started. He's known as kind of being brash and loud and yelling during his sermons and talked about sex a lot and wrote a book on sex that became a New York Times bestseller. I was at his church in Huntington Beach, California, because I'm from Orange County, and I don't recall using patriarchy there, but it was everything patriarchy would have been without calling it patriarchy, which was interesting because I didn't notice it until later on. All the men there were there to find wives, and all the women there were there to find husbands. This one was in your face. It wasn't just, hey, we're here because we want to network. It's actively pursued from the pulpit. It was talked about. It was encouraged. It was almost like if you weren't, it was kind of weird. But it was also a very young church. I was in my early 20s, and most people were in their early 20s, early to mid 20s, some a little bit older, but it was just such a young church.
Mark Driscoll is another Reformed figure who is both influenced by and sometimes affiliated with Doug Wilson. He built a reputation as the cussing pastor, a hyper-masculine truth teller who wasn't afraid to be brash and confrontational, sort of the epitome of the young, restless, and reformed trope. He overlaps with a particular subset of Christianity, where church events might include a pastor or youth pastor ripping off his shirt and climbing in a cage for a mixed martial arts fight. I promise I'm not making this up. There's even an apparel company called Jesus Didn't Tap, as in, if Jesus went willingly to the cross, you should be able to hold your own in a fight without tapping out. It can be easy to laugh that kind of thing off from a distance, but I think it's vital to realize how deeply it speaks to some people, particularly young men who feel overlooked by society. When Driscoll made crude jokes about women or gay people and blasted the limp-wristed feminization of America, some otherwise well-meaning believers were able to laugh along or look the other way, because he was also connecting to something very real and raw that wasn't being met elsewhere.
I think it depends on where you came from. So a lot of us came from what we would have termed squishy evangelicalism, felt bored Jesus, and we weren't pushed in church growing up. Maybe women had a different experience than the men did at church. But for the men, we didn't feel like we were pushed or told to be anything or encouraged to do much. A lot of us, myself included in this, very much reacted to this when we went to Driscoll, because Driscoll was the one who kind of beat us up during the sermon. And that felt good after church not feeling like it did much for us. It didn't both reach our felt desires, but also I can get a better message during the week. I want to grow. I want to do something. I want to build something. When you got testosterone coursing through your veins in your late teens, early 20s, you want to do something. And Driscoll met that desire. And a lot of these patriarchal teachers, they really meet that desire for a lot of young guys. We're just not sure what to do with all of this pent-up energy in us. That spoke to me. It was an hour and a half long sermon. They were ridiculously long sermons. But he is such a gifted speaker. If there's anything that Driscoll is, people should listen. If you type his name in, you can find all of his old sermons are cringe. He is such a gifted rhetorical speaker. He's really good at using metaphors, and he's got fantastic stories, and they just really draw you in. And after an hour and a half, that felt like nothing. You felt like you yourself were preached to, but also you felt something. It wasn't just, oh, that was an interesting message. It was, that hit me, that hurt a little bit. And just like anybody else, if there's some like physical stuff to it, you kind of come back to it. It's a little bit of a hit. Like he says things I think a lot of guys want to say, but you can't say in polite company. That's why you have a lot of men on anonymous accounts. It's why you have men behind fake names or whatever it is, and they can say the things I think they really do want to say, and they want to say it without repercussion or without consequence, because you can't say it at work, you can't say it at home. And so seeing people do this is kind of cathartic because it's in public, because they're known for saying it in public, and there's a little bit of you that wishes that you could do this too. I'm not saying all guys think this, nor is this our primary thought, but there is something to us. Those are the things sometimes we think, and we can't say it, and so it just sticks with us until it bursts one day. And that's why I see guys doing really dumb things in public and really scary things and crime. I think it's a lot of it builds in us, and then we have no outlet, and then all of a sudden it bursts. Jordan Peterson, he's like the father figure for a lot of guys, the tempered speech, but also I think a lot of guys see some wisdom in him. I see some wisdom in him too. I think he's got some interesting biblical takes. But in terms of his cultural takes, I don't think are that far off. That's some of the stuff that guys are looking for. And so when you see current patriarchal culture, they say the things a lot of guys want to say and can't say. Not to say if guys were allowed to say these things or act like this, that guys would be better. But there's very few outlets for guys. And that leads to some of this stuff. And it's not great, but it's understandable knowing kind of how guys think. And that's where patriarchal culture really hits us. And we don't notice this until 30s, 40s, 50s. That didn't do anything. Yeah, it felt good and it felt like a little bit of release, but it didn't do anything good. It didn't build anything. It didn't help anybody. It wasn't respectful. But you just don't think that when you're 20 or you're 25. You just don't think these things. I couldn't have told you that this was patriarchy. I don't think that term was used. It wasn't parroted. I mean, I would have known what it meant, but I wouldn't have seen it or understood it in the context of the church. It wasn't until looking back, all the markers without the current wave of patriarchal teaching and without it being kind of on the cultural tip of the tongue. At least not my understanding. It wasn't there then. It wasn't talked about as much then.
The Seattle church that Driscoll built his name with, Mars Hill, eventually imploded because of his various controversies and abuse allegations. But within a couple years, he was able to start over with a new church in Arizona. Because like Wilson, he's proven to be somewhat inflammable in the face of criticism. But in his wake, he left a lot of congregants, including Peter, who were wondering where do they go next.
I went from Mars Hill to a small church in Irvine, went to an Acts 29 church, which is they're not a denomination, but it's like a church planting network that Mark Driscoll founded. So we were still kind of in the culture a little bit. They would have been considered complementarian, which I don't consider myself complementarian, egalitarian, or anything like that, more nuanced. But it's kind of a step down from patriarchy, where there's still roles and defined roles. And there's a little bit of a man is still above the woman, and the woman is still subservient or submissive to the man, and the man is leader. Better culture wasn't really talked about. We had a lot of Mars Hill rejects and dropouts, people who went to Mars Hill and were looking for a church to heal after Mars Hill, but not all the way outside the church, nor a liberal or progressive church. It was like we wanted to find kind of a middle ground. Some of us reacted all the way and left the church. Some of us deconstructed. Some of us left. I would still consider myself reformed in certain ways. So it was still kind of along those lines. We went to Village Church in Irvine. Still very similar, counseled by the pastor there when we were getting married. I thought it was a fairly healthy church. After Village, we went to San Diego for seminary, Westminster Seminary, California. And that's where I dove deep into kind of Reformed church waters, Presbyterian waters. I understood where I had come from, where these things came from, where patriarchy came from, the dangers of patriarchy, the dangers of that church movement. That's where I started learning and then looking back on experiences before. And it's like, I was in that culture for a long time. And I couldn't have told you why I left other than Mars Hill imploded. So all of us were forced to leave in some way, shape, or form. But had Mars Hill not imploded, I don't think I would have left. I still would have been in those waters, because they tagged me and a few other people to plant a church in Phoenix. I ended up not going because Martell fell apart. It spoke to me, and I didn't realize until later what I was in. And they wouldn't have called it patriarchy in some contexts, but it was more so we were learning the unhealthy aspects of church culture, the unhealthy aspects. I know there's a lot of stuff that you talk about of the biblical counseling movement, a lot of unhealthy aspects of the machismo church culture, the young, restless, reformed church culture, which was big in the 2000s. That's where a lot of these guys came from. That's where we were learning where those things came from, where tradition was coming. It was a lot more, where does our tradition come from compared to all these other traditions? Where do we find ourselves in? Which was helpful to situate myself and understand I'm not just following some random thing. Like, this has either historical precedent or it has a cultural line historically. It was there that I was learning, where did these ideas come from? Where do these movements come from? Where do they lead to? What kind of effect did they have on people? Thinking more deeply about where I am in this context, who I'm speaking to, and where their context is coming from as well.
Peter received a few pastoral calls from churches after he graduated seminary, essentially a job offer. But he ended up not taking them, and he's never formally pastored a church. Up until last year, when he left the ministry, he worked in what's called pulpit supply, which means preaching and doing various pastoral roles for a church, but not being officially installed as the church's pastor. That work helped him in learning how the function of pastor can look very different from church to church, including the role of pastoral counseling. In some contexts, pastors offer spiritual direction or mentorship, but for mental health concerns, they refer to actual therapists. In other churches, though, there can be little to no distinction between pastoral counseling and mental health therapy.
It depends sort of on the size of the church and your tradition. The smaller the church, the more the pastor is expected to kind of do everything, and that includes counseling. Whether that be the pastor or those who are not pastors, they're lay people who are in leadership position, who also take on counseling roles as well. The bigger the church, the less stable the tradition that you come from, the more that counseling is kind of doled out to other people. And I was at a very small church, 50, 60 people. So I would have been the main counselor, and the people there would have looked at me outside of Sundays as a counselor. They wouldn't have called me a counselor, but the way they viewed me would have been basically like a free counselor. He got all the spiritual knowledge, and we need that stuff. We had one course. It was a 2-credit-hour course, so 24 hours of teaching. I think it was called pastoral counseling. And then we had it in bits and pieces in other classes, but nothing like professional training in counseling. Although we would have sort of understood it as, well, this makes you a counselor. This is among the duties that you have as a pastor. And this is the baseline teaching, the baseline instruction that you need as a counselor. Thank the Lord that at my seminary, they made very clear, you are not a counselor. You can help people, but you are not a counselor. And if you have a real need in your congregation, you better contact professional licensed counselors. That is not your job. So thank God that was my seminary. But other seminaries too, and other less introspective seminaries, or seminaries that kind of don't expect their pastors to be all things for all people, to kind of know our place professionally, which can sound weird as a pastor. It's like, I'm a pastor, that's what I do. I preach and I teach and I do other things and I can help, but I'm not a counselor. Yeah, we had very little counseling. I do remember him saying, you are not a counselor. You are there to help people if they have a spiritual need, whatever it may be, but make sure, and this is something that we did at the church that I was helping at, that you partner with counseling agencies that actually know what they're doing, that have training in this, whether or not they're Christian. If a person has depression, I don't care if the counselor is Christian or not, they're going to help them with their depression, hopefully, and have licensed, trained education background to do so. I would get texts from the elders at the church letting me know of one of the issues, and I won't say the person or what they had. Serious issues, extraordinarily serious issues. Like, I can't deal with this. I'm not going to take the time to go find a Christian counselor. He needs somebody right now. I don't care what their background is, or else this person could die from what he's struggling with. But I've both heard too much and seen too much to think otherwise.
During seminary, the church where Peter did his internship was in Eastern Washington, only a couple hours away from Christ Church in Moscow. But he had no idea how much his life was going to crash into Doug Wilson's world.
I'd heard his name before. A good amount of people know about his psalm sing fiasco during COVID because President Trump at that time, and now again, retweeted some of the stuff that was happening in Idaho around the psalm sing, calling themselves martyrs. And so they sort of came into the national eye after that. I still wasn't super aware of them. I just knew from the seminary I went to that he had some really weird things theologically and culturally. Very, very political and weird theologically. And it wasn't until 2021 at the internship that I had that the family I stayed with, and I won't say their name, the family I stayed with had a history with Doug Wilson. They had previously gone to his church decades before. And I talked to the mom of the family, and the mom of the family had, to put it bluntly, horrific abuse under Wilson and the elders. Not by them, but from her husband. It was dealt with extraordinarily poorly by the elders and pastor. Her husband should have been in prison for what he was doing. She was telling me this story. It was 4th of July, and I was like, holy crap, this is insane. I've never heard of this at a church, ever. I think I went back home after that, looked up the church, and then typed in abuse or something. I forget what I typed in. This list of abuse cases and what had come out started showing up, and I was like, oh, shit. What has happened here? Did I accidentally stumble on something? And I was looking for her case. I was looking for what happened to her, and I couldn't find it. How has somebody not written about this? How did this not make news? And for some reason, and I don't know why, and I had not heard of the church abuse statistics. I had not heard of the abuse statistics overall, that those who report was like the very, very tip of the iceberg of those who are actually going through it. None of that was like kind of in the back of my head. But for some reason, I thought, well, if hers is not there, I wonder what else isn't there. I'd seen some, but I had not seen others. And the ones that I saw were horrific. If hers isn't there, I wonder if somebody else's abuse is not there as well. So I went hunting. I went hunting for more and connected with a social media think tank. They're called Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow. I had looked at some of their stuff. I knew some of their admins. There's a bunch of admins behind it. I had run a podcast before. I'd sort of talked about abuse. We had been alert and aware at the seminary that this does happen. And then when abuse does happen, your first thing isn't to talk to the perpetrator. Your first thing isn't even to talk to the abuse victim. Your first thing is to call the cops or some sort of law enforcement. Again, thank you to my seminary for teaching me some of this stuff. So I started looking, I started digging and talking to the think tank. And I had some podcasting background before, and I had talked to some who had researched on abuse in the church. I'd seen some articles go after Doug Wilson or patriarchy or church abuse, not to the extent I thought it should have been done, sort of like with the SBC back in 2018 with the Houston Chronicles article or with the Catholic Church. I hadn't seen anything done to quite that level, and I was like, I think something has to be done to that level for people to care. One article or a few articles isn't going to cut it. There's another woman, Sarah Steinkorb, who wrote a Vice article that got a lot of attention, but because she's a woman and not Christian, it didn't get the attention that I thought it deserved. Well, shoot, I'm a man and I'm a Christian. I guess I have to do this. No one else is going to do this, nor is it going to kind of hit in the way that it should. And I'm also trained in this. I'm reformed, I'm trained in this stuff, and I care. That's what got me into it.
Because Peter had done so much research and spoken to so many different people, I asked him to help us understand more about what makes Christ Church unique and what that might mean for the kind of counseling they offer.
The one thing that's very different about Christ Church, beyond even the megachurch pastors people can think about, because they're not a megachurch. Megachurch is anything 2,000 people or bigger, generally speaking. So they're smaller than a megachurch. So you wouldn't think that they would have this big of a footprint or this big of popularity or able to move the national conversation the way that they have. But it's because they do everything in-house. They just own so much of that area. And when you're there, everything's so insulated, so isolated. You get your schooling done there. You get your books there. You get your multimedia there. You can get counseling there. You can get your legal help there. You can get your job there. You go to church there. You meet your spouse there. It's all encompassing, but he is not focused purely on the church. He's focused on you can live your entire life within this little isolated bubble in Moscow, Idaho.
In the context of therapy, that means congregants are expected to look to the church for help, not an outside professional. And what they'll find at the church is a form of nouthetic counseling, which says the solutions you're seeking are not in medicine, psychology, or science. They're in the Bible.
Noutheo is Greek for like reproving or convicting. It's all counseling basically comes down to sin. I don't think they would necessarily say that. And it's a slightly different flavor than the broader umbrella term biblical counseling. Counseling is we got to get down to what your sin is. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, if your marriage is going poorly, if you're young and you're worried about your future life, or if you had sex outside of marriage, or if you're looking at porn, whatever it is, everything comes down to some root sin. And we have to find what that sin is. And if you don't tell us what the sin is, you're not being honest with yourself. And our counseling won't get anywhere if you're not honest with the root nature of anything that you're going through. And they would say that for basically everything. They'd say that for everything's root is in some sort of sin in your life, something that you've done wrong, something that you're not trusting God enough, something that you are guilty of or shameful of. And so all these things are coming back to bite you, or you're anxious because you're not trusting God enough. You're depressed because you're not delighting in God enough. But it almost always goes around, yes, there is some root sin. We have to find out what that root sin is. You repent of it, and voila, there you go. There's your counseling for the day.
To that end, Christ Church Biblical Counseling Center sees Scripture as, and I quote, the authoritative and sufficient source for counseling content, because Jesus Christ serves as the personal solution to all of our counseling difficulties. The primary goal of every counselor should be to introduce counselees to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. This perspective isn't unique to Christ Church, and it extends far beyond formal biblical counseling centers. But biblical counseling centers are incredibly common, with many evangelical churches across the U.S. offering in-house counseling ministries or staff who operate under the same theological framework. And this is relevant. Millions of Americans attend these churches that approach mental health crises primarily through a spiritual lens, often attributing psychological distress to hidden sin, weak faith, or a lack of submission. For those in crisis, this approach can lead not to healing, but to deepened shame and further harm. Regardless of how one views the broader deconstruction movement, whether as a necessary reckoning, a spiritual crisis, or simply a cultural trend, there's one consistent theme that emerges across countless personal accounts. Many who leave evangelical spaces do so carrying stories of harm at the hands of biblical or pastoral counselors. These are not isolated incidents. People struggling with anxiety may be told that they lack faith. Those with depression might be urged to repent. Trauma survivors might be asked what sin they haven't confessed. Others are told they're under demonic attack. Instead of therapy, they're handed scripture. Instead of support, they're met with suspicion. And instead of healing, they often walk away carrying deeper wounds than what they arrived with. Many biblical counseling centers, including the one in Moscow, reject any secular counseling intervention that is at odds with the Bible. Because, and I quote, secular counseling therapies add nothing essential to the understanding and resolution of counseling problems. End quote. All of these beliefs and policies are grounded in views of biblical patriarchy. It's the flour baked into everything Christ Church does.
Patriarchy is the lens you view the dynamics between men and women, both between men and women and to leadership. And so if you're talking to a man, the patriarchal lens they see you through is, are you leading? Are you failing to lead? Are people submitting to you? Is your wife submitting to you? Are you worthy of submission to? Are you building? Are you successful? Or are you not building a lineage? Are you not building a dynasty? For the man, it's traditional, I guess you can call it, manhood for past few decades. If you want to think of like the 1950s, 1960s, nuclear family, that's their vision of manhood. And that's the lens through which they view men, the lens through which they counsel men, the lens through which they preach to men. And then if you view the corollary of women in this as well, it's most counseling for them and the stuff that I've heard have been, are you submissive enough? Are you joyful enough? Countenance, like a bright countenance in these circles is really big. Joy is really big. Sadness or dourness or downtrodden is not looked well upon in these circles. If you're not happy all the time, you're always an advertisement for the church. You're always an advertisement for the community. People won't want to move there if you're sad, if your marriage is broken, if your relationships are hard. Their counseling ethos. Are you presenting yourself well? Are you training up your kids? Are your kids wayward? That's a big deal for parents. If your kids are wayward, that means you're not being a good enough parent, or you're not being strict enough, or you're not spanking them enough, educating them enough. It's not so much that they view you have to subscribe to patriarchy and therefore all your problems will be gone. It's like a lens they view everything through. And it's the lens they view men through. It's the lens they view women through. The lens they view children through. And so everything they do, counseling or preaching otherwise, is not so much the standard. It's, are you meeting this sort of standard of manhood, of womanhood, or of being a kid in the system too? There is a specific mold that they have for man, for woman, and a child. You are compared to that mold and you're expected to fit that mold. Everything is marketing and advertising. And that's counseling is towards that. Pastoring is towards that. Schooling is towards that. Watching movies is towards that. Everything is through that lens.
The rigidity of that lens, coupled with the insularity of Christ Church, the fact that they strive to meet all of their congregation's needs themselves, makes it very difficult for anyone, whether inside or out, to talk openly about the prevalence of abuse and how it's addressed in that community.
The problem when they talk about abuse is they don't bring anybody else outside the church in the conversation. That's first and foremost their big deal. They tend not to call the cops. They tend not to link with law enforcement. They tend not to link with actual trained licensed therapists or counselors or whatever it may be. Their first desire is to handle it in-house, because the overarching thing is we need to make sure our community is inviting and joyful. And if people know that this person is in an abusive relationship or other people in abusive relationships, people are not going to want to move into our community. Women will be told that you can't let this be known. It's going to ruin our reputation. It's going to ruin this man's reputation. It's going to ruin this leader's reputation. And then behind that, it's, I won't say every case, but a good majority of cases are sort of, what did you do to deserve this kind of abuse? Were you, again, this is the lens that they view through patriarchy. Were you subverting your husband's authority? Were you being difficult to your husband? Were you being too opinionated? Were you sexually available to your husband enough for him to be satisfied? I've heard that more than basically anything else. It's the women were not having sex enough with their husbands, and therefore their husbands were acting out because they couldn't do anything with all this buildup. Couldn't do anything with this, and so they acted out. And so instead of listening, bringing in authorities, and believing, trusting the woman in her word, they would put, if not all, a good bit of the responsibility on the woman herself. Maybe if you're available, your husband wouldn't have gone and gotten an affair. Or maybe if you were more available, he wouldn't have snapped at you and hit you or been verbally abusive to you. Maybe if your house was just a little bit cleaner. Maybe if your kids were more well-behaved. Maybe if you had dinner available every night of the week. Maybe if you just kind of sucked it up and suffered like Christ, you would receive your husband with a happy face. And he wouldn't feel the need to put you down because you're so opinionated or you were downcast this day. Your husband doesn't want to deal with your emotions. Your husband wants to come to a diminutive home that he can just kind of relax in. Those are all the things I've heard told both directly and indirectly to women in these counseling, both their biblical counseling and then their pastoral counseling conversations.
The insularity of Christ Church can also make it seem very strange or even cultish to those of us on the outside. And when you consider how Wilson is prone to being intentionally outrageous and inflammatory, it might be tempting to write this off as a sideshow anomaly. just a weird little bubble on the fringes of Christian extremism. But Peter says this would be a mistake.
It's because people thought he was fringe that he grew. It's because everybody else thought, well, that's a random backwoods pastor who's got weird beliefs in Moscow, Idaho, this tiny little nothing city in Idaho, and even Moscow themselves. And there are some that were fighting, but Moscow themselves, like, he's just a weirdo and he's not going to have any voice. We're a small town. If he were in Los Angeles or New York or Dallas or whatever it may be, maybe he would be a bigger personality, but we're too small. He's too small. I think the very fact that people thought he was fringe was how he grew. They're extraordinarily strategic. And so what we're seeing today is the result of 40, 50, 60 years of slow, deliberate planning. What we're seeing now isn't even close to what they're desiring or planning. This is the very beginning. And it's not to say that things are going to get worse necessarily, but this has been a long time coming. We've been kind of lulled into a stupor, thinking that things were getting better or he's small. But that's the point we try to make it. The longer you think there's fringe and small, the more cover he gets and the more cover they get to do what they want to do and build what they want to build. Stop calling this stuff fringe. This is a small movement. Even though we haven't seen this in the national conversation, you haven't seen patriarchy talked about, I view this sort of the same way that I think Black and minority people have wanted white people to think of Black and minority people for a long time, and saying, you're just now having this conversation about race and racism or whatever it is. We've been having this conversation for a long time, and you're now just joining the conversation. Don't let like this didn't exist before. I think that's very similar to this conversation. This has been in some circles for a long time. This is very American dominated. We're just now coming to the conversation that has been had for decades. We just haven't taken it seriously, and has led to destruction of people's lives, destruction of women's lives, destruction of a lot of people's lives, whether it be counseling and preaching, whether it be in the church, whether it be in the academy or schools. That's why we do what we do on the series. Is we don't focus on one particular movement. We don't focus on one particular incident. We don't focus on one particular person or one particular case. We try to show themes and strands and threads between this and say, we are where we are in the cultural moment, in the church, in abuse, whatever it may be, because we thought this was fringe. This has always been there. And now we're just paying attention and wondering what happened. That's maybe what I want people to come away with. It's not like start taking this serious, but it's like this has been serious and join the conversation.
One of Peter's hopes with Sons of Patriarchy is to expose people to all sorts of resources and other voices to help further this conversation. He doesn't want you to hear the podcast and stop there. He wants it to be a launching point to learn about people working in all kinds of different sectors who are offering insights, criticisms, and alternatives to the current heyday of patriarchy and nationalism. One book he recommends is a historical overview called Jesus and John Wayne. But if you check out Sons of Patriarchy, you'll find a whole lot of other resources if you want to keep going. I want to thank this week's guest, Peter Bell, host of Sons of Patriarchy, not only for the important work he and his team are doing, but also for taking the time to join us on the show. A huge thank you as well to our writer, Bo Denton, whose sharp research and thoughtful writing shape every episode. And finally, thank you to our incredible audio engineers at Peachtree Sound for bringing it all together. We hope you'll join us next time as we continue this series exploring the world of biblical and pastoral counseling.